A hidden treasure, 2 murders, and 1 legendary detective. Can you solve this case before Poirot does? In the heart of the crumbling kingdom of Ramat, a tempest was brewing, a storm not of nature, but of human fury. The air crackled with the tension of revolution, whispers of an uprising that had swept through the streets, shaking the once imposing walls of the monarchy. The royal family, once untouchable, now trembled in fear. There was no longer any room for doubt. The reign of King Idris, ruler of Ramat for over 3 decades, was coming to an end. Prince Ali Yusuf, heir to the throne, stood alone on the balcony of his private chambers, his silhouette framed against the dying light of dusk. He knew the revolution was inevitable. He could hear the distant shouts of protesters echoing through the palace grounds. His time was running out. But amidst the chaos, he harbored a secret tone so dangerous, it had the power to undo everything. With swift and deliberate movements, he summoned his most trusted ally, Bob Rawlinson, a man as loyal as he was fearless. Bob had served the royal family for years, never once questioning his orders. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. The mission Prince Ali entrusted to him would test his mettle in ways he had never imagined. Bob, the prince's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried an undeniable weight. I need you to do something that will ensure our kingdom's survival, even if we do not. Bob's heart pounded in his chest as he listened intently, his gaze locked on the prince. You must take this fortune, Bob, Ali continued, his hands trembling as he handed over a small, intricately carved box. The weight of it felt almost too much for Bob to bear. He glanced inside to find glittering jewel spirals, diamonds, and rubies, their glow unnatural in the dim light. It must leave Ramat at once, the prince ordered, his voice trembling with urgency. Smuggle it out. Do whatever it takes to make sure it reaches safety before the revolution swallows us whole. Bob nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had been trusted with tasks of great importance before, but nothing like this. The fate of Ramat itself rested on his shoulders. But there was no time for hesitation. Under the cover of night, Bob carefully concealed the precious gems within the hollow handle of a tennis racket, an unassuming object, seemingly harmless, yet perfect for carrying such a fortune undetected. He placed it into the hands of his niece Jennifer, a young girl with a sharp mind and an unwavering sense of loyalty to her uncle. She was unaware of the gravity of what she was about to carry across the borders of Ramat, unaware of how her life would soon be intertwined with the fate of a kingdom. Meanwhile, in the shadows, a figure observed from a neighboring balcony. She was cloaked in the darkness, her eyes glinting with an unsettling, almost predatory curiosity. Who was she? Why did she watch with such intensity as the racket was handed over? Was she an ally or something far more dangerous? Before Bob could ponder the answer, the distant roar of a plane's engine pierced the night air. His stomach twisted. It was time. The plane, a private jet meant to carry Bob and the prince out of the kingdom, soared into the skies. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As the aircraft flew over the barren desert, far from any sanctuary, disaster struck. A violent explosion rocked the plane, sending it spiraling toward the earth. The sound of tearing metal and screaming wind filled Bob's ears as the world around him twisted into chaos. The desert below them was empty, silent, and still, its golden sands stretching endlessly. As the plane crashed into the unforgiving terrain, both Prince Ali Yusuf and Bob Rawlinson were thrown into an abyss of nothingness. The wreckage lay in the sand, burning, while the secrets of the kingdom, the jewels, remained hidden in the hollow of the tennis racket. As the sun began to rise, the desert swallowed the wreckage whole, and the fate of the prince, Bob, and the jewels remained shrouded in mystery. What happened to the jewels? Who would find them? And what lengths would they go to in order to possess them? The kingdom of Ramat, already teetering on the edge of collapse, would never be the same. The woman on the balcony, unseen and forgotten, had watched the entire scene unfold. Her glinting eyes were the only witnesses to the tragedy, her presence leaving a chilling sense of unease in the air. And as the first whispers of the revolution grew louder, the questions multiplied. What was truly hidden in the handle of that tennis racket? and who would ultimately seize the power concealed within. Cliffhanger ending. The answers, like the jewels, lay buried waiting to be uncovered in a dangerous game where no one could be trusted. But as the echoes of the crash faded, one haunting thought remained: someone in Ramat knew the truth, and they were coming for the jewels. Would they find them before the revolution tore the kingdom apart? Would Jennifer, unaware of the storm she was carrying, become the key to Ramat's salvation or its final destruction? The prestigious Meadowbank School. 3 months had passed since Jennifer Rawlinson's life had been turned upside down, and now, as the fall air chilled the English countryside, a new chapter began. With her destination set, she stood at the threshold of Meadowbank, an elite girls' school nestled in the heart of a secluded village, known not only for its academic excellence, but for its ironclad discipline and an unsettling reputation that whispered among the locals. As the school gates loomed ahead, Jennifer couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a world entirely different from the one she'd left behind. The imposing stone walls of the grand building stood like sentinels, watching over the young girls who passed through them. Meadowbank was not just a school, it was a fortress. It was a place where secrets were whispered and power, wrapped in tradition, was carefully guarded. Inside, things were no less formidable. Miss Bulstrode, the school's headmistress, a woman of sharp features and even sharper resolve, stood on the precipice of a decision that would shape the future of the school. At the age of 62, Miss Bulstrode had ruled the institution with a firm but fair hand for nearly 3 decades. Yet now, as she mulled over her retirement, a new question had begun to gnaw at her. Who would take over her kingdom? As Miss Bulstrode walked the polished hallways of Meadowbank, her gaze swept over the faculty. Every teacher, every staff member held a piece of the puzzle, though some of those pieces might not fit together so easily. There was Miss Chadwick, a co-founder of the school, now slowing with age but still fiercely loyal. She was a woman of few words, yet her sharp eyes caught every detail. It was said she knew the school's every corner and secret, though how many of those secrets she was willing to share was another matter. Then there was Miss Vansittart, the German teacher. Poised, immaculate in her appearance, and respected for her capability, Miss Vansittart had a reputation for never letting anything living slip through her grasp. Her eyes were always calculating, always measuring. Was there more to her than her calm demeanor suggested? Miss Rich, young and dynamic, was the new face among the staff. She brought with her a breath of modernity, her progressive ideas often clashing with the older, more traditional attitudes of the school. The students adored her, but some of the older staff, Miss Chadwick included, could not help but find her energy unsettling. Miss Blanche, the glamorous new French teacher, arrived with an air of mystery. Her beauty was striking, almost distracting, but her presence felt calculated. She was the one to watch, though whether her charm was just a facade or a weapon, no one could quite tell. And then there was Grace Springer, the gym teacher, who was as brash and overbearing as they come. She ruled the sports grounds with the same no-nonsense attitude she applied to the rest of her life. Her sharp tongue and tougher-than-nails demeanor made her a polarizing figure. But one thing was clear: no one could deny her power. But lurking in the shadows of Meadowbank's halls was Anne Shapland, Miss Bulstrode's new secretary. Charming, efficient, and just a little too perfect, Anne seemed to fit right in. Yet there was something about her, something that didn't quite add up. She was too young, too smooth, and too secretive. What was it that made her always look over her shoulder, as though she was afraid of something or some finding her out? Finally, there was Adam Goodman, the gardener. To the casual observer, he appeared simple, almost invisible, blending into the background like a fixture of the landscape itself. But Miss Bulstrode had noticed the glint of something deeper in his eyes, a flicker of something that told her he was not as he seemed. What lay beneath the surface of this unassuming man who seemed to know far more than he let on? As the new term began, it wasn't just the students who felt the weight of uncertainty in the air. The faculty, too, seemed poised for something. Something they couldn't quite put their fingers on but knew was coming. The school's pristine walls, always so unyielding, were beginning to feel like a cage-on that was about to crack open. And then, on the second day of term, something changed. The faintest ripple, a shadow flitting by the window, a quick glance exchanged between two faculty members in the corner of the staff room, a muffled conversation in the hallway that ceased abruptly as Jennifer passed. The school felt different. The very air felt heavy with anticipation, like a storm was brewing just beyond the horizon. Something was about to happen. Something big. The students may have returned to their lessons, the teachers to their duties, but the cracks in the facade of Meadowbank were beginning to show. And with every passing hour, the secret that had quietly nestled itself into the heart of the school seemed to pulse, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. A new term had begun, but Jennifer Rawlinson would soon learn that this was not the simple beginning of her academic year. She had unknowingly walked into the eye of a storm of hidden agendas, unspoken alliances, and secrets too dangerous to keep buried much longer. And as she turned the corner into the school's courtyard, she felt it a sensation in the pit of her stomach. Something was waiting for her. But what? Cliffhanger ending. Just as Jennifer stepped into the courtyard, she saw a figure standing near the old oak tree, a figure she recognized. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Anne Shapland, the secretary. But what was she doing out here, in the middle of the day, when no one else was around? As Jennifer took a step closer, the figure suddenly turned, and their eyes locked. There was something cold in Anne's gaze, something that made Jennifer's blood run cold. Then, without a word, Anne reached into her coat pocket and pulled something out, a small folded piece of paper. Jennifer's breath hitched as she realized. It was the same kind of paper she had seen before, the same kind her uncle, Bob Rawlinson, had written on the one that had contained the secret of the jewels. Anne's lips curled into a smile, one that wasn't quite reassuring. "Jennifer, I think it's time we had a little chat," she said, her voice smooth and chilling. And then, in the blink of an eye, Anne vanished, disappearing into the school's shadowed corridors. What was on that paper, and why had Anne suddenly sought her out? The truth, Jennifer now realized, was far darker and more twisted than she had ever imagined, and it was only just beginning to unfold. Murder in the night. It was one of those rare, silent nights where the world seemed to hold its breath. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the sprawling grounds of Meadowbank School. The wind barely stirred, and the only sound that could be heard was the faint rustle of leaves from the tall, ancient trees that lined the school's outer boundaries. Inside the sports pavilion, an unsettling stillness had settled, interrupted only by the distant hum of crickets and the occasional creak of the building's wooden frame. Miss Grace Springer, the gym teacher with a brash, commanding presence, had been there alone for hours, likely preparing for the next day's classes or indulging in some quiet reflection. But what she was not prepared for was the shattering of silence that would come at the stroke of midnight. A single gunshot pierced the air, sharp and sudden, as though the night itself had been torn open. The sound echoed across the grounds, carried on the wind. The tranquility of the school shattered in an instant, sending a ripple of unease through the faculty and students. But it wasn't until Miss Chadwick, the co-founder of the school, and Miss Johnson, the ever-dutiful school matron, ventured into the night to investigate, that the true horror of what had transpired began to unfold. The two women, both seasoned veterans of Meadowbank, had seen their fair share of oddities, but nothing in their years of service had prepared them for the sight they were about to witness. As they approached the sports pavilion, a heavy, foreboding silence hung between them. Both women felt it, the chill in the air, the unnatural stillness. And then, as they turned the corner to the entrance, their eyes fell upon the body of Grace Springer, sprawled out in an unnatural, grotesque position on the cold wooden floor. Her once brash and powerful frame now lay lifeless, her arms outstretched, as if reaching for something just out of grasp. Blood pooled around her, dark and glistening under the moonlight, staining the floor beneath her. The gunshot wound was evident, the source of her demise clear. But what struck them both immediately was the look on her face. It was frozen in a final expression of disbelief, a mixture of confusion and terror. Grace Springer had died in the midst of something far more sinister than just an accident. What in God's name? Miss Chadwick's voice trembled, her usual calm demeanor faltering for the first time in decades. She bent closer to examine the body, her eyes darting to the gun still clenched tightly in the dead woman's hand. It was a message, wasn't it? But who had sent it, and why? The question lingered in the night air like the echo of the gunshot itself. Miss Johnson, pale and shaky, stepped back, her hand clasping her mouth in shock. It can't be. She was so full of life, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The two women stood frozen for a moment, their minds struggling to comprehend the enormity of the situation. They had only just spoken to Grace earlier that day. She had been as confident and brash as ever, bullying the girls into submission, commanding the gymnasium with her usual energy. How had it all turned so suddenly, so violently? Miss Chadwick's thoughts raced. The gunshot hadn't been heard by anyone else. It was as though the killer had known the precise moment when the whole school would be asleep. But more importantly, the weapon was still here, in the same room. A person didn't shoot someone and then just leave their weapon behind, did they? There had to be more. Much more. As the two women were about to take another step forward, they were interrupted by a voice. Miss Vansittart, the poised and calculating German teacher, had appeared from the shadows, her usual composure shaken. Her elegant features were drawn tight in concern, her eyes wide with the cold knowledge that something was terribly wrong. She glanced down at Grace's body, her face paling but her stance unwavering. "This is no ordinary tragedy," Miss Vansittart said quietly, her tone colder than the night air. This is murder." But before anyone could respond, there was another noisy, scuffling sound coming from the far corner of the pavilion. The sound of footsteps. Someone was still in the pavilion. A moment of silence followed as Miss Chadwick, Miss Johnson, and Miss Vansittart all turned their heads, eyes narrowing in suspicion. Who else could have been here? And why? The atmosphere thickened with a sense of dread. And then, as the moonlight flickered through the cracks in the wooden panels of the pavilion, the women saw it. A shadow, moving swiftly in the far corner of the room, vanishing behind the thick pillar that held the structure upright. Someone had just witnessed the discovery. But who? And had they seen too much? Cliffhanger ending. A breathless moment of silence fell upon them, broken only by the rustling of the wind outside. Without a word, Miss Chadwick motioned for Miss Johnson to stay behind. She was about to approach the corner when bang, a second gunshot rang out. The sharp, brutal sound sent them all recoiling in horror. And then, in the flickering moonlight, Miss Vansittart collapsed, blood staining the floor beneath her as her body hit the ground. For the second time that night, the pavilion was filled with the sound of death. Was this another murder? Was the killer still here, in the shadows, watching them? The question lingered, unanswered, in the chilling stillness of the night. What would happen next? The answers were just beginning to unravel, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning of something much darker, and someone, somewhere, was orchestrating it all. Inspector Kelsey arrives to investigate. The air was thick with tension when Inspector Kelsey arrived at Meadowbank. The morning mist still clung to the ground like a ghost, its presence a stark contrast to the storm of uncertainty that had descended upon the school. The murder of Grace Springer, and now the sudden, unexplained collapse of Miss Vansittart, had drawn the authorities to the gates of this prestigious institution. But as Kelsey stepped out of the car, his sharp, calculating eyes surveyed the estate not with the usual professional curiosity, but with a growing suspicion. This was not a simple murder. Something far darker, far more dangerous was unfolding beneath the surface. Kelsey, a man of few words but boundless determination, strode toward the entrance, his coat billowing behind him. His mind was already working at a fever pitch, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle that had begun to take shape since the first gunshot rang out. Inside the school, Miss Bulstrode, the formidable headmistress, was waiting for him. Her usually composed, no-nonsense demeanor had been shaken in recent days, but she still held her ground. Standing beside her was Adam Goodman, the unassuming gardener who had been a fixture at Meadowbank for years. Kelsey had never suspected the man of anything more than keeping the grounds in perfect order until now. Miss Bulstrode's eyes darted nervously toward the door as Kelsey entered, his tall frame casting a long shadow on the polished wooden floors of the headmistress's office. There was something cold and calculating in her gaze, but also an underlying tension that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. "Inspector," she said, her voice steady but betraying a flicker of unease, "I trust you've seen the chaos we've endured." "Yes, ma'am," Kelsey replied, his eyes never leaving her face. "But I'm afraid the circumstances surrounding this murder have taken a rather alarming turn. I need to know everything you've seen, everything you know." Miss Bulstrode's lips pressed together in a tight line. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded slightly, signaling for Adam Goodman to speak. Adam shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering briefly to the door before he stepped forward. A change had come over him, something Kelsey hadn't seen in the years he had tended the grounds. The simple gardener had become someone else entirely. "I'm afraid, Inspector, I've been hiding something from you all," Adam began, his voice surprisingly steady, yet there was an edge to it like a man who had been forced to live a lie for far too long. "I am not just a gardener. I'm an agent for British intelligence. And this investigation is about far more than the murders at Meadowbank." Kelsey's brow furrowed. This was not what he had expected, but the weight of Adam's words landed with an undeniable force. The tension in the room thickened, and for a fleeting moment, Kelsey wondered if there were more to this case than anyone had yet realized. "Adam," Miss Bulstrode said, her voice low and urgent, Is it true? You've been tracking them?" Adam nodded, his face grim. "The jewels. They were smuggled out of Ramat in the most unlikely of places, and I'm here to find them before they fall into the wrong hands." Kelsey's mind reeled. Ramat Kingdom caught in the chaos of revolution. Jewels hidden within a tennis racket. The pieces were slowly coming together, but with each revelation, 100 more questions arose. "Tell me more," Kelsey pressed, his tone more demanding now, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice. "What exactly is going on here?" Adam glanced at Miss Bulstrode, who gave him a subtle nod, urging him to continue. "I've been watching, waiting," Adam said, his voice lowered as though the very walls might be listening. "The jewels Prince Ali Yusuf entrusted to his friend, Bob Rawlinson, were smuggled out of the kingdom before the plane crash. And they've been hidden somewhere within this school. Somewhere nobody would ever think to look." Kelsey's heart skipped a beat. "Here, at Meadowbank?" "Yes," Adam replied, his eyes hardening. "But the real danger is not the jewels themselves, it's the people who are hunting them, and the lengths they'll go to in order to retrieve them." The air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. This was no longer a simple case of murder, it was a high-stakes game of espionage, betrayal, and death. "Someone here knows more than they're letting on," Adam continued. "And I have reason to believe one of your staff is involved. The people behind this are ruthless, Inspector. They will stop at nothing to get what they want." Kelsey's eyes narrowed. He had learned long ago that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. But now, as he stood in the heart of this pristine school, the walls seemed to close in on him. Who could he trust? Who had a hand in this treacherous game? Who had a hand in this treacherous game? And most importantly, what was the cost of finding the truth? Cliffhanger ending. Just as Kelsey was about to press Adam for more information, the door to the office suddenly burst open, and Anne Shapland, Miss Bulstrode's charming but secretive new secretary, stepped inside. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she gasped, breathless, "but I found something I think you need to see. It's in the library." Kelsey's pulse quickened. "What is it?" Anne hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously to Adam. "It's a letter that, well, it's from Ramat, and it says that the person you're looking for, they're already here." The room fell silent. The chilling realization of what she had just revealed sank in. Someone was already in their midst, someone they hadn't even suspected. The questions that had been swirling now had answers, but they only led to more mysteries. And Kelsey knew with a growing sense of dread that the clock was ticking. The disappearance of Shasta. The weekend had arrived like a breath of fresh air, with the sun casting long shadows across the manicured grounds of Meadowbank School, a quiet calm falling over the campus. Yet beneath the surface, a storm was quietly brewing. In one of the school's many rooms, Shaista, the spirited cousin of Prince Ali Yusuf, sat restlessly by the window, her eyes tracing the horizon. Her presence had been a whispered secret among the students, a protector among them who had arrived under the guise of safety. But Shaista herself carried the weight of a hidden truth. She wasn't just at Meadowbank for education. Her family's political connections and her ties to the Ramat throne had drawn her here, seeking protection from the revolution that had consumed her home country. Her days at the school were full of whispers and secrets, yet there had always been a sense of safety. At least that was until that fateful Saturday morning. It was a morning that began like any other, with the campus full of the bustling energy of students heading off to their weekend activities. Shaista had planned a quiet day for herself, perhaps a walk by the gardens or time spent in the library, but things were about to take a darker turn. As Shaista strolled near the school gates, she was approached by a man in a dark suit, his face partially obscured by a cap. His demeanor was calm, reassuring even, and he greeted her with the familiarity of someone she should have known. "Miss Shaista, your uncle sent me," the man said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "He's waiting for you in the car. He thought you might need a change of scenery this weekend." But Shaista's instincts screamed otherwise. A chill crawled down her spine as she eyed the man, sensing something was terribly wrong. Her hand brushed the hidden locket around her neck, one connection to her family, a reminder of the promise her cousin Prince Ali Yusuf had made to protect her. Yet she hesitated, caught between the sudden paranoia rising in her chest and the deep-rooted desire to trust the familiar. Before she could say a word, the man stepped closer, his hand outstretched to guide her towards the waiting car. The glint in his eyes was all too telling, a predatory gleam masked by false kindness. In a flash, Shaista's heart hammered in her chest. She realized the truth. This wasn't her uncle's chauffeur. It was an abduction. She turned to run, but a strong hand gripped her arm, pulling her toward the car. Her scream was muffled by the roar of the engine as it sped off into the distance. Back at the school, the news of Shaista's disappearance spread like wildfire. Whispers filled the halls, each student and faculty member stunned into silence, their minds racing with the same horrific thought: who could be behind this? And why? Jennifer, still shaken by the murder of Grace Springer, felt a sudden unease gripping her as she walked toward the tennis courts. Her friend, Julia Upjohn, was waiting for her near the practice courts, her eyes wide, her expression filled with confusion and concern. "Jennifer, don't know how to explain this, but—" Julia's voice trailed off, her eyes flicking nervously between Jennifer and the tennis bag slung over her shoulder. "I think I've seen something strange with your racket." Jennifer furrowed her brow in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Julia, always sharp and perceptive, took a step closer, her eyes narrowing on the handle of the racket Jennifer had been carrying. "It's not the racket itself, it's what I saw earlier. I saw a woman, someone who wasn't a student, trying to exchange your racket for a new one. She seemed to be in a hurry, but she didn't look like she belonged here." Jennifer's eyes widened, her fingers instinctively tightened around the handle of the racket. She could feel the weight of it, no more than just a simple piece of sports equipment. Something about it felt different. Something hidden, something valuable. The jewels? Was it possible? Julia's instincts told her that there was more to the racket than met the eye, and despite Jennifer's hesitations, she convinced her to hold on to it for now. "Listen," Julia said in a hushed tone, her eyes darting around nervously. "We need to be careful. There's something going on here. I feel it. Something about that woman, it's not right." Jennifer didn't reply, her mind spinning as she glanced down at the racket once more. Her curiosity had been piqued, but so too had her fear. She had no idea just how deep this mystery ran, but she had a growing suspicion that the answer might lie within the racket itself. Cliffhanger ending. Later that night, as Jennifer lay in bed, unable to sleep, a knock echoed softly at her door. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Who would be knocking at this hour? She opened the door cautiously, only to find Julia, her face pale and wide-eyed. "It's gone," Julia whispered. "The racket. Someone's taken it." Jennifer's breath caught in her throat. The racket was gone, and with it, perhaps the only clue to the mysterious events surrounding her cousin's disappearance and the dangerous game being played within the walls of Meadowbank. The walls seemed to close in around her as she processed the word. Someone was playing a game much darker than she had ever imagined. Who would dare to steal the racket? And why? What was the secret it held, and who was hunting it? The second murder, a shocking development. The early morning fog had barely begun to lift when the sound of something extraordinary shattered the fragile stillness of Meadowbank. The school, once a sanctuary of academic excellence, had now become a place steeped in death and fear. The discovery was as horrific as it was chilling. Miss Vansittart, the poised and elegant German teacher, was found dead in the same sports pavilion where Miss Springer had met her untimely end. But this time, the circumstances were far more brutal. Miss Vansittart had been bludgeoned to death, with a sandbagger lifeless body sprawled on the cold, unforgiving floor, a pool of blood staining the earth beneath her. The shock was immediate and absolute. Panic gripped the school like a vice. Word spread quickly, there was no denying it now. Meadowbank was no longer a school, it was a crime scene. The parents, terrified for their daughter's safety, began to withdraw their children one by one. Soon the halls, once filled with chatter and laughter, were eerily silent, save for the whispers of suspicion and fear. Jennifer stood frozen, her mind unable to fully grasp the horror unfolding around her. 2 murders in as many weeks, both women with their own histories, their own lives cut short under the shadow of something far darker than anyone had imagined. As panic swept through the school, Julia Upjohn, whose curiosity had already led her to strange discoveries, could no longer stand by the sidelines. She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something far more sinister than a mere string of murders, was at play here. The tennis racket, the one that had been stolen from Jennifer's room, was at the heart of it all. Julia's instincts had never steered her wrong, and she had grown increasingly certain that the key to the murders and to the terrifying mystery that gripped Meadowbank lay hidden in that racket. She waited until the corridors were empty, the bustle of students temporarily silenced by the wave of fear that had settled over the school. With trembling hands, she retrieved the racket from its hiding place, her heart racing. She could feel the weight of it now, more than just a sporting instrument. With a careful and steady hand, Julia pried open the handle. The secret that had eluded her for so long now revealed itself. The jewels. A fortune in precious gems, carefully concealed within the hollowed-out space. Their glittering beauty was at odds with the darkness surrounding them. But as Julia gazed at the hidden treasure, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. These jewels were not just a fortune, they were a symbol, a dangerous one. Before she could fully process the magnitude of her discovery, a cold, shiver-inducing thought crept into her mind. Someone knew. Someone had discovered she was getting closer to the truth. And just as that thought crossed her mind, a noise at the door made her heart stop. A faint rustle. A footstep. Someone was outside her room. Julia's breath caught in her throat as she rushed to hide the racket, securing it in the only place she could think, under the floorboards beneath her bed. She dared not breathe, her pulse racing in her ears. The door creaked open slowly, just a crack, and a figure slipped inside. A shadow. She watched in horror as the figure moved, their footsteps soft but deliberate, as they scanned the room. Her instincts screamed to run, but she forced herself to stay perfectly still. She had to wait. She had to stay hidden. The figure seemed to linger near her bed, too close for comfort, their hand brushing the floor beneath. Was it possible they had already discovered the racket? Then the figure stopped. Something in the air shifted, a brief, almost imperceptible pause before they turned and swiftly exited the room, closing the door behind them with chilling precision. Julia could hear the sound of footsteps fading into the distance. Who was that? Why had they come? Had they found the secret? Or was there something even more dangerous waiting just outside her door? The silence that followed was deafening. Julia's hands shook as she pulled the floorboards back up, retrieving the racket with trembling fingers. But there was no time to think. She couldn't stay at Meadowbank any longer. She had seen enough, and now she knew too much. With her heart pounding in her chest, Julia made a decision. She would go to the one person who might be able to help her unravel the dark web of deceit and danger threatening to engulf them all. Hercule Poirot. The legendary detective's name had become a whisper among the staff and students, a name spoken only in the most desperate of times. The only man sharp enough to piece together the fragmented puzzle that had been left in the wake of these murders. The only one who could help her expose the sinister truth. With the jewels in hand and her mind racing, Julia made her way out of Meadowbank, leaving the chaos behind her. She fled to London, where the legendary detective would help her face the looming darkness head-on. Cliffhanger ending. But as Julia reached the train station, ready to begin her journey, she felt an unfamiliar presence. Someone was watching her. Turning, she caught a fleeting glimpse of a figure lurking in the shadows, their face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Julia's heart skipped a beat. Had someone followed her? Was she walking straight into a trap? The figure stepped forward, revealing nothing more than a gloved hand. A letter no more than a small folded piece of paper was placed gently into her hand. Julia's fingers trembled as she unfolded the note, reading the chilling words scrawled in ink. "It's too late. The game has already begun." The world around her seemed to freeze. Who had written this? What game was she talking about? Before Julia could even process the message, the figure was gone and disappeared into the crowd. The letter slipped from her hand, carried away by the wind. Was it a warning or a threat? What was about to happen next? Poirot at Meadowbank. The fog had settled around Meadowbank like a thick blanket, muting the once bustling sounds of the school, now overshadowed by fear and suspicion. The gates, usually open to welcome parents and students, stood ominously closed as though protecting the dark secrets within. But for one man, the very gates seemed to beckon. Hercule Poirot, the legendary Belgian detective, had arrived. His small, yet perfectly proportioned figure stood in sharp contrast to the gloom that hung over the school. His sharp eyes scanned the surroundings, his mind already working, piecing together the fragments of a story that was just beginning to unfold. Poirot's reputation had spread far and wide, and his name carried a weight of respect and fear. When Julia Upjohn had contacted him, detailing the sinister happenings at Meadowbank, it hadn't taken long for him to decide that this was no ordinary case. No, there was something deeper here, something more dangerous than simple murder. As he made his way through the school's grand entrance, he was greeted by Miss Bulstrode, the formidable headmistress who looked every bit the part of a woman who had seen and weathered many storms. But even her composed exterior couldn't hide the nervousness in her eyes. Poirot smiled politely, his signature mustache twitching ever so slightly as he examined the school. "Ah, Miss Bulstrode," Poirot began, his voice calm, but edged with an unmistakable authority. "Your school is indeed picturesque. But I sense, behind this beauty, there lies a darkness." The headmistress stiffened, but only for a moment. She led Poirot through the hallowed halls, the walls lined with portraits of former students and benefactors, each one seemingly watching him as he moved. As they walked, Poirot's sharp gaze didn't miss a thing. The trembling hand of Miss Shapland, the secretary, the worried glance exchanged between Miss Chadwick and the gym teacher, Miss Springer, before her tragic demise. Poirot stopped in front of the sports pavilion, the site of both murders. His eyes narrowed as he observed the building's worn exterior. Despite the brilliant moonlit night that had previously bathed the area in a haunting glow, there was nothing beautiful about it now. The very air around it seemed thick with death. "This is where it all happened, yes?" Poirot asked, his tone almost conversational, but his eyes piercing. Miss Bulstrode nodded, clearly uncomfortable. Poirot could sense the unease radiating from her, but he wasn't here to solve her fear, she was here for the truth. Poirot's next step was to interview the staff, but he didn't approach them with the usual formalities of most investigators. His charm was disarming, his questions seemingly casual, but with every word, he dug deeper, gently peeling away the layers of suspicion. He began with Miss Shapland, the school secretary. She was poised, elegant, but there was a coldness about her. Poirot noted the tight smile, the slight clenching of her jaw. "Miss Shapland," Poirot asked, eyeing her carefully, "you must be privy to many secrets in your role, but tell me, what secret would you consider worth killing for?" Her lips quivered, and for a brief moment, Poirot could see a flicker of something behind her eyes: fear, guilt, or something more sinister. Before she could respond, Poirot turned to Miss Chadwick, the loyal co-founder of the school, whose hands trembled in the midst of their conversation. Poirot's sharp mind began to piece together the subtle signals: a nervous tick here, an unguarded look there. The investigation shifted when Mrs. Upjohn, Julia's mother, arrived at the school unexpectedly. A former intelligence agent, she had sharp eyes that never missed a detail. Poirot was intrigued when she revealed something shocking. Julia had recognized a dangerous figure from her past, someone from her mother's time in the intelligence service, at the school on the first day of term. "This man, Mrs. Upjohn began, her voice shaking with both fear and frustration. "He's not just anyone. He's someone I thought I'd never see again, someone who's far more dangerous than you could imagine." Poirot leaned forward, his face serious for the first time. "Tell me, madam." Poirot's voice was low, his words carrying the weight of experience. "Who is this man, and why has he returned?" Mrs. Upjohn hesitated, her eyes darting around the room, as if the walls themselves were listening. Finally, she spoke in a hushed tone. The name that left her lips was like a death sentence. "Ramat." Ramat. The name hit Poirot like a punch to the gut. He had heard it before. It was linked to international espionage, to dangerous individual high-profile criminals, and covert operations. And the jewels, the same jewels that were hidden within the tennis racket. They were the key. But what had they been smuggled out of Ramat for? Poirot's mind raced, but he knew he needed more. He needed to find the man. As the pieces began to fall into place, Poirot turned to Mrs. Upjohn with a question on his lips, but the sudden sound of a sharp knock at the door interrupted him. A letter-no envelope, just a single folded sheet of paper, was slid under the door. Poirot's hand was already reaching for it, his fingers brushing the paper before anyone else could move. He unfolded it swiftly, reading the message with his characteristic concentration. "You are closer than you think, Poirot. But be careful. Not everyone here can be trusted. The game is far more dangerous than you realize." The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Who sent this? What was this game? Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the room. A dangerous web was closing in, and the stakes were higher than ever. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot stood still, absorbing the implications of the message. His mind worked furiously, but his calm demeanor never wavered. He turned slowly to Mrs. Upjohn, his voice a mere whisper. "Madame," Poirot said, his eyes piercing, "it seems the game is afoot, and it has already begun to play us all." Before he could speak further, there was another knock on the door. This time more urgent, more insistent. Poirot's eyes darted to the window, noticing a figure outside a shadow, obscured by the evening mist. Was it a threat, or an ally? He stepped toward the door, but as he reached for the handle, the power went out. Darkness fell, and with it, a feeling of unparalleled danger. Was this the end for Poirot? Or was it just the beginning? The truth unveiled. The grand assembly hall of Meadowbank was unusually still. The walls, once echoing with the laughter of students, now stood silent, like silent witnesses to the horrors that had unfolded. Students and faculty gathered, all murmuring among themselves, anxiously awaiting the final word from Hercule Poirot. The tension was unbearable, each second stretching longer than the last. They had been kept in the dark for too long, and now Poirot, the master detective, was about to reveal the truth. The doors to the assembly hall creaked open, and Poirot entered, his presence commanding immediate attention. He stood at the center of the room, his piercing gaze sweeping over the crowd, taking in every face, every expression. There was a quiet authority in his stance, a sense that the moment they had all been dreading and expecting had finally arrived. Poirot cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the silence. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his accent crisp and precise, "I ask that you pay attention. For what I am about to reveal will not only explain the terrible events that have unfolded here, but will also shatter the very foundation of everything you thought you knew." The room held its breath. Poirot's eyes moved deliberately to Miss Bulstrode, standing at the back of the room, her face pale, her hands gripping the edges of the chair. He then turned to Julia Upjohn, who had watched the unfolding events with a mixture of fear and determination. His gaze shifted again to the others, Miss Chadwick, Mrs. Upjohn, and even the once seemingly unflappable Miss Chaplin, who now stood in the crowd, her face carefully composed, but her eyes betraying the faintest hint of unease. Poirot spoke again, his voice now filled with undeniable gravitas. "You all know the name Shasta. You all know the young woman who vanished from Meadowbank under mysterious circumstances. But the Shasta you have been so worried about, she was an impostor." Gasps filled the room. Miss Bulstrode's eyes widened, and Julia clutched the back of the nearest chair as if to steady herself. Poirot continued, unflinching. "The real Shasta," Poirot said, his eyes narrowing as he locked onto the gathered crowd, "was taken from this school long ago, hidden away in the shadows. The impostor who posed as her was planted by a criminal organization, one that had been searching for something far more valuable than a mere princess." The room fell into a stunned silence, and Poirot let the weight of his words settle before continuing. "The jewels," Poirot continued, his tone sharp, "the jewels that have been hidden in the racket were smuggled out of Ramat. They were the key to this entire web of deceit and treachery. But what you don't know, what none of you knew, was that the murders Miss Springer, Miss Blanche, they were no random acts of violence. They were purposeful, planned." He paused, letting his words sink in, watching the shock ripple across the room. "Miss Springer's death," Poirot said, his voice unwavering, "was the result of her stumbling upon something she shouldn't have. She uncovered the search for the racket. She came too close to the truth, and she paid the price for it." Miss Bulstrode's hand trembled as she reached for the edge of the podium. Her breath was quickening. Poirot was leading them to something darker, and she could feel the grip of terror tightening around her chest. Poirot's eyes flashed, his gaze narrowing as he addressed the next shocking detail. And as for Miss Blancher, death was not the work of a mere killer. She was killed because she tried to blackmail the true murderer. She sought to take the jewels for herself, using her knowledge of the hidden treasure. But in the world of espionage and betrayal, blackmail is a dangerous game, and Miss Blanche paid with her life. A collective breath was drawn in as Poirot stepped back, his hands folded in front of him. The pieces were all falling into place, and Poirot could see the realization dawning on the faces around him. But there was more. Poirot's voice dropped, and a shiver ran down the spine of every person in the room as he revealed the final, devastating truth. The mastermind behind all of this. Poirot's eyes locked onto Miss Chaplin, whose face had turned an alarming shade of pale, is none other than Anne Chaplin. The room seemed to hold its breath, the name hanging in the air like a death sentence. Miss Chaplin, the elegant, poised secretary, the woman who had seemed above reproach, stood frozen. Poirot's voice sharpened. Anne Chaplin, also known as Angelica's, a ruthless espionage agent, known for her cold efficiency and unparalleled cunning. She was the one who saw Rawlinson hiding the jewels in Ramat and orchestrated the entire scheme to retrieve them. She planted the impostor, manipulated everyone around her, and ensured that no one would stop her from claiming what she believed was rightfully hers. The crowd's shock was palpable. Julia gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. Miss Chaplin, who had been standing motionless, suddenly took a step backward, her eyes darting toward the door. Poirot's eyes glinted, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips as he drew closer. But even the most cunning criminals can make a mistake. Before he could finish, Miss Chaplin lunged for a hidden pocket inside her jacket. A gun appeared in her hand, gleaming under the harsh lights. She aimed it squarely at Mrs. Upjohn, her face twisted with rage. "You should never have come back," Anne Chaplin spat, her hand shaking, her voice barely contained with venom. "I will kill you, just like I killed the others." But before the shot could be fired, a heroic figure stepped into the line of fire. Miss Chadwick, trembling but determined, threw herself forward, intercepting the bullet meant for Mrs. Upjohn. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the hall like a death knell. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Miss Chadwick crumpled to the floor, her eyes wide in shock, blood staining her blouse. Poirot rushed to her side, his expression grave, but the damage was done. Anne Shapland, her expression a mix of fury and desperation, turned to flee, but before she could take another step, the door to the hall swung open with a deafening crash. The police had arrived. But as they closed in, Anne Shapland had one final, twisted laugh on her lips. "You may have stopped me, Poirot, but remember this, the game is far from over." Cliffhanger ending. As the detectives closed in, Miss Chadwick's lifeless body was taken away. Poirot stood frozen, his mind still unraveling the threads of the case. But the final words of Anne Shapland echoed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from the end. What had she meant? What game was she still playing? Was there something more lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike again? As Poirot looked at the stunned faces around him, he knew one thing for certain. The final twist of this dark, tangled mystery had not yet revealed itself. The final revelation. The room was heavy with silence. The atmosphere at Meadowbank felt thick, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in on those gathered in the assembly hall. The truth, the full weight of it, hung in the air, suffocating every breath. The culprit had been unmasked, and the final twists were almost too much to bear. Yet Hercule Poirot had one last bombshell to drop home that would shake everyone to their core. The grand hall, filled with tense faces and wide eyes, waited. Anne Shapland, the infamous Angelica, was in handcuffs, her gaze fierce, though the anger in her eyes was slowly fading into something deeper, perhaps even resignation. Julia Upjohn, standing next to her mother, was still trembling, her world shattered by the revelation that the woman she had once trusted had been behind so much darkness. Poirot stood in front of the gathered crowd, his sharp features shadowed by the weight of the moment. The air was still, the tension unbearable. His hand, usually so controlled, trembled slightly as he adjusted his bow tie, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces before him. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the silence, "I have one final truth to reveal that will answer all the lingering questions that plague your minds. It is a bitter truth, but it must be said." Everyone held their breath, unable to speak, unable to move. The words they had been waiting for, the words that would end their nightmare, were hanging on the tip of Poirot's tongue. Poirot's eyes flickered to Miss Chadwick, who was standing at the back of the room, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously as though she feared the ground might swallow her whole. Miss Chadwick had been a figure of mystery from the very beginning, a woman who seemed to be hiding something, always lurking in the shadows of the faculty room, her emotions flickering like a candle in a windstorm. Poirot stepped forward, his voice now low but clear. "I have told you that Miss Shapland, Anne Shapland, is the mastermind behind the deception that unfolded here. But I was wrong. The second murder, the murder of Miss Vansittart." Poirot paused for a fraction of a second, his piercing gaze never leaving Miss Chadwick, was not the work of Anne Shapland at all. The room gasped in shock. Julia's hand flew to her mouth. Miss Bulstrode's face twisted in disbelief, and even Mrs. Upjohn stiffened, her eyes wide with growing confusion. Was Poirot wrong? Had they all been misled again? Poirot let the silence stretch for a moment, his every word hanging in the air like a delicate thread. He could see the shock spreading across the room like wildfire. But he wasn't finished. "The truth," Poirot continued, his voice now like the calm before a storm, "is that the true murderer of Miss Vansittart was Miss Chadwick." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Miss Chadwick recoiled, as though struck, her hand pressing against her chest. Her eyes widened with a look of disbelief, but it was too late. Poirot had already seen through her. "It was you, Miss Chadwick, who killed Miss Vansittart," Poirot said, his voice sharp, his eyes locked onto her. "You, driven by jealousy, by madness, by an uncontrollable desire to possess something that was never yours. A stunned silence descended upon the hall. Miss Chadwick's eyes darted frantically between the others, her face pale, lips trembling. The once quiet, composed woman had shattered, her carefully built persona now crumbling to dust. Her fingers twisted in her hands, and her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. She was trembling now, her facade finally cracked, and everyone could see the raw truth of what she had been hiding all along. But why? A voice called out, barely a whisper from the back of the room. It was Julia, still stunned but determined to understand. Why would you do it? What drove you to murder her? Poirot's gaze softened as he turned to Julia, his eyes glimmering with the understanding of the twisted psychology he had just uncovered. He turned back to Miss Chadwick, the detective's voice gentle yet firm. "Ah, it is always the question, n'est-ce pas? Why? Why does one person kill another? But my dear Miss Chadwick, the answer is simple: jealousy, greed, the hunger for something one cannot possess. Miss Vansittart, beautiful and talented, had everything that you did not, did she not? She had the favor of those around her, and perhaps, just perhaps, she had the admiration of someone you wanted. You could not bear it. So, you took from her what she had, ending her life in a fit of madness." Miss Chadwick's eyes darkened with fury, and for a moment it seemed as though she would lash out. But instead her face twisted into something far more unsettling, a bitter, sardonic smile. "You are wrong, Poirot," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "I did not kill her out of jealousy. I killed her out of love. I did not kill her out of jealousy. I killed her out of love." A cold shiver ran through the room. The words hung like a poison in the air. Love. The very idea seemed unthinkable. How could love drive someone to such madness? How could it fuel such a horrific act? Poirot, ever calm, regarded her with a look that seemed almost pitying. "Love, you say? But what kind of love is that, Miss Chadwick?" he asked softly, his voice like velvet. "A love so twisted, so distorted, that it justifies murder. A love that blinds the mind to the value of another's life." The room remained eerily silent. No one could quite fathom what had just been revealed. Poirot continued, his voice lowering once more. "You killed her because you wanted to possess the life she had, but in doing so, you destroyed your own." The finality of Poirot's words was like the closing of a tomb. The weight of the revelation was heavy, suffocating the room in its finality. Miss Chadwick's last breath trembled in her chest as she realized that the game was truly over. Poirot turned away from her, his eyes moving slowly around the room, absorbing the stunned faces of the gathered audience. But just as he was about to give the final command, a sudden, distant sound cut through the thick silence. A loud bang, the sound of a door slamming open, footsteps echoing down the hallway. A voice, familiar, frantic, and desperate. And then, the screeching voice of a woman calling out, "Poirot, it's not over. It's never over." Cliffhanger ending. Poirot's gaze snapped toward the door, his brow furrowing with a deepening concern. The room held its breath, as the air around them seemed to vibrate with unease. "The game," Poirot muttered, more to himself than anyone else, "is far from finished." The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, and with each echo, a fresh wave of dread swept through the assembly hall. Something was coming, something that none of them could predict. What was it? What was about to unfold? What was about to unfold? The aftermath. The Grand Assembly Hall, once a battleground of secrets, lies, and danger, was now eerily calm. The tension had lifted, but only just. The air still felt heavy with the weight of what had unfolded, with the lives changed irreparably, and the truths that had come to light. Meadowbank had faced the storm and emerged, battered but intact. The aftermath, however, was still settling like dust in the wake of an earthquake. Miss Bulstrode stood at the front of the room, her posture straight, her face set in its usual stern expression. But beneath that facade, there was something else relief. She had been through much, and it seemed that for the first time, she was allowing herself to let go of the weight of responsibility. With Miss Shapland gone, the school could move forward. But it wasn't just the loss of a criminal that would change things. Meadowbank needed new leadership, someone who could heal the wounds, restore the school's reputation, and protect its legacy. "I have decided, after much consideration," Miss Bulstrode announced to the gathered staff, "that Miss Rich shall take over as headmistress of Meadowbank. She will guide this school with integrity, honor, and a sense of justice that we all need after the dark days we've faced. This is not just about restoring order, it is about rebuilding the trust we lost." The staff nodded, some with surprise, others with admiration, but all agreed. Miss Rich, though younger and softer than Miss Bulstrode, had proved herself during the crisis brave, steady, and quick to act. As she stepped forward to accept the mantle, her eyes met Julia's with a silent gratitude. There was no denying that the future of Meadowbank would now rest in her hands, but in that moment, it was clear she would not fail. In a quiet, almost secretive moment, the jewels, the heart of the entire conspiracy, were returned. Their rightful place had been waiting for them, in the hands of Prince Ali Yusuf's widow, a woman long hidden in the shadows, and their son, the silent heir to a dangerous legacy. The jewels, once symbols of greed and bloodshed, now represented a restored honor. Their return wasn't just a resolution for the case, it was the sealing of a story that had spanned decades. But it wasn't just about jewels or lost treasures. For Julia Upjohn, the journey had been one of self-discovery, courage, and an unexpected transformation. From a quiet, observant girl to the heroine of Meadowbank, she had earned her place in the tapestry of the school's history. Her heart raced as she was called to the front. In Miss Bulstrode's hand, a small box sat, gleaming faintly under the overhead lights. The box opened, revealing an emerald, its deep green glow like a silent reminder of the mysteries she had unraveled, the dangers she had faced, and the bravery she had shown. Miss Bulstrode's voice softened slightly. "This emerald," she began, "is not just a gift. It is a symbol of your courage, Julia. You have given us all the strength to face the truth, no matter how dark, and for that we are forever grateful." Julia's eyes glistened as she accepted the emerald, feeling its weight in her hand. A simple gesture, but one that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The journey of fear and uncertainty had changed her, and she realized, perhaps for the first time, that she wasn't the same person who had walked into that school weeks ago. The girl who once was too quiet, too uncertain, was now a young woman who understood the strength of her own voice. But as the tension lifted and the gratitude filled the room, a sense of unease lingered. The darkness that had descended on Meadowbank had not been eradicated completely. As much as Poirot's intellect had unraveled the threads, some questions remained unanswered. Some shadows still hung over the school. Poirot, standing to the side, adjusted the brim of his hat. He had seen much in his career, faced enemies and mysteries that had tested even his extraordinary skills. But this particular case had left a lingering taste, not of failure, no, but of something deeper, more unsettling. He turned to Julia, who was standing nearby, the emerald still warm in her hand. His gaze softened slightly, though his voice remained as sharp as ever. "Mademoiselle Julia," he said, his French accent cutting through the stillness, "I must confess, there is a sense of unfinished business here, no? Something that does not sit quite right, even now." Julia glanced at him, brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" Poirot's eyes gleamed with a mixture of intrigue and caution. "There is a pattern to every puzzle, mademoiselle, but there are always pieces that do not quite fit, even after the solution is found." The tension in the room shifted slightly, as if they could all feel it, the unseen specter still lurking, the promise of another storm on the horizon. Miss Rich, watching from a distance, caught the exchange between the two. Her face hardened for a brief moment, then softened into a smile. But it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Poirot nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then turned toward the door. "I must be off, mademoiselle. The world does not stop for any of us, even after the truth has been revealed." With that, Poirot left the hall, his footsteps echoing in the stillness behind him. As he made his way down the hall, Past the now empty classrooms, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something. Something vital. Something buried deep within the heart of Meadowbank, something that would only be uncovered when the time was right. Julia, holding the emerald, stood alone for a moment, lost in thought. The mystery was over, but the unease remained. As Poirot's car pulled away from the gates, Julia's eyes strayed toward the shadows of the mansion's windows where she could have sworn she saw something. Someone watching. The air had grown cold again, and the sense of finality felt elusive, like a half-remembered dream. Was this truly the end, or was something else lurking in the depths of Meadowbank, waiting to rise again? Cliffhanger ending. Just as the door of the school was closing behind her, Julia caught sight of a faint figure standing near the farthest window. It was gone in an instant, but the image was burned into her mind. And then the phone rang. Would it be the last mystery to haunt them all, or the beginning of something far darker? The unanswered questions swirled in the air, and the shadows of Meadowbank seemed to stretch even longer as the night began to fall.